This is our video lecture for our chapter on campaigns and elections. And so in this chapter, we're going to look at, the campaign process and the elections process here in the United States, how it works, some of the issues with it, and, is our election system working, well in the United States. So, the United States Constitution delegates much of the responsibility for elections to the states. The time, place, and manner clause essentially says that the states get to determine the time, the place, and the manner in which elections will take place. It sets very few guidelines other than the fact that fair elections have to be conducted, that the general election will take place the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November in even numbered years. But especially when it comes to the primaries, much of the responsibility is left up to the states. Some states still use the caucus process. Some states use voting. Different rules regarding registration, getting your voting rights back after committing a felony. All of that kind of stuff is left up to the states. We elect all of the House of Representatives every 2 years. Everyone is up for re-election every 2 years, and then 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. The House serves 2-year terms, the Senate serves 6-year terms. The president, as we know, is elected every 4 years, and this is a presidential election year. And so, in those presidential election years, the election tends to get more attention and more coverage than it does in those midterm off years. We elect over 520,000 different officials in the United States. And one of the questions about our election process is it too overwhelming? Those of you who have voted in the primary, you may have noticed when you get that ballot, there's a lot of different things to vote for, from the federal to the state to the local level. And sometimes voters complain that they feel overwhelmed, that they are not completely educated about everybody that's on the ballot. And, is there anything that we could do to alleviate some of that, stress of the election being overwhelming? We haven't quite come up with a good solution for that just yet. Now, one of the biggest questions when it comes to American elections is there too much money in the elections process? If we look at 2016, in 2016, all candidates running at all levels spent $6.5 billion on their campaigns. And so, this creates a problem for our elected officials, especially if you think about someone serving in the United States House of Representatives. They have to run every 2 years. So, one full year of their term is pretty much dedicated to campaigning and raising money. And in those years, they may not be focused on, what is facing the country. Right now, all of our House reps are having to run for re-election this November. And in the middle of that, manage a crisis, that we're dealing with, the coronavirus. And so, this need to raise money is something that has been criticized, that it gives too much influence to the wealthy, to corporations, to special interests that can exert influence over our election with money. There's been a lot of different things put into place to try and regulate how much money can be spent in our election. Back in 2002, Senators John McCain and Russ Feingold passed a bill called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. And they wanted to limit the amount of money that could be spent in elections, especially as it pertained to businesses and corporations. But very quickly, a few organizations came forward and sued the government over this bill. And this is where we get the Citizens United decision that we've talked about a little bit. This is the Supreme Court decision that ruled that money essentially equals free speech, and that corporations have the same rights to free speech as individuals. And this has been a highly criticized decision. John McCain and Russ Feingold both did not agree with this decision. You've heard, President Obama and Bernie Sanders and other politicians talk about this decision and think it should be overturned. And this is an interesting debate. Are corporations entitled to the same free speech as individuals? Corporations are definitely made up of individuals, but who gets to decide? Who gets to speak for the corporation? Is it the CEO? Is it the board? That there's a lot of questions there. And then another case, McCutcheon versus the Federal Elections Commission, Supreme Court overruled limits on individual contributions. So this allows very wealthy people to spend insane amounts of money, far more than the average American can spend. And we've talked about this a bit this semester. And so it brings up the question, in our country, is democracy really just a game for the wealthy? Do Does one party get an advantage from this? Well, what we see is many wealthy interests will donate to both parties. That way, no matter who wins, they can call in a favor. Um, Incumbents tend to raise more than new challengers, and incumbents have a much higher likelihood of being reelected. We see about a 93% reelection rate in the House and an 89% reelection rate in the Senate. And one advantage that incumbents have is that they have money stockpiled from previous elections, so they don't have to always fundraise as hard as their opponent. And then, the big question is then is are our elected officials more accountable and responsive to their donors than to the people they are supposed to be representing? Some things that have made it easier for corporations and wealthy people to inject money into our system are political action committees, and we've touched on these in our interest group section. But political action committees are organizations that exist solely to fund elections, and they can exist to fund a particular candidate, a particular party, or a particular cause. Typically, these groups will be made up of 50 people or more, and most of them are associated with some type of interest group. And so some groups, like, say, the NRA, there's the NRA, the organization, and then the NRA also has a political action committee that they raise money to donate to candidates with. But political action committees typically, they are partisan. They are motivated by issues or by party affiliation. And PACs can give $10,000 to any one candidate, 5,000 for the primary and 5,000 for the general. Super PACs are organizations that raise and spend unlimited amounts of money to promote a candidate, but the catch is that they cannot coordinate with the candidate or the campaign. So they can spend as much money as they want, provided that they're not coordinating, their strategies with the campaign itself. And a lot of this money will come from businesses, unions, wealthy individuals. We saw in 2016 foreign countries donating to PACs to influence our elections here in the United States. But as an individual, you are limited to donating $2,700 per candidate that you want to give money to. So if you want to give far more than that, you use political action committees and super PACs to do that. Another thing that exists at the grassroots level is what we call bundling. This is where groups of individuals come together to raise the maximum individual amount, and then several individuals donate that money to candidates or causes. 527s, we won't go into those too much, but these are essentially organizations that are advocacy groups. Maybe it's for causes like, say, homelessness or healthcare or things like that. They can form a companion organization to their nonprofit to donate to candidates that support their causes. But again, they cannot coordinate with the campaigns or the candidates. These types of groups spent over $1 billion in the 2016 election. So this has given corporations and wealthy people this mechanism to donate unlimited amounts of money in our election system. So much so that there's a lot of people that argue that it takes power away from the average American. But at the end of the day, all this money can't tell you how to vote, and that's why it's important that everyone gets out there and votes and makes sure that they are heard. Now, the process for presidential campaigns. Well, for the most part, this will pertain to the presidential election, but some of it applies to Congress as well. But for the presidency, the candidates, we've seen the process this year. The Democratic side, we had 25 different candidates in 2016. I think there were 18 candidates running for the Republican nomination. And so there's this whole process that we're still going through to find out who the nominee will be. The party that already holds the presidency, in this case the Republicans, they don't really have to go through this because most of the times they're going to go with their incumbent candidate. But the party that does not control the presidency, someone has to get the nomination, and that's what the primary is for, to narrow those individuals down to one person. Right now, we still have, it looks like Joe Biden will be the candidate for the Democrats, but Bernie Sanders has not dropped out yet. So, most people are assuming that he will eventually, but right now, Biden has a pretty significant lead. We've been through the primary process. So we talked about the caucus, how some states still hold a caucus where people meet and gather and debate each other and try and get people to vote for the candidate they support. And then at the end of the night, all that support is tallied and decides who gets that state's delegates. Here in Texas, and most states do either an open or closed primary where we show up and we vote, and the winner of the state's votes gets delegates. They will be divided accordingly. Um, Super Tuesday, that was the day that our primary was the official election day for our primary, and it's called Super Tuesday because a big chunk of states, I believe it's 17 states, will vote on that day. And so after Super Tuesday, it's usually clear who the likely nominee will be. Um, Sometimes we don't know. Like right now, we assume Joe Biden will be the nominee, but Bernie Sanders is still holding in there, and there's still some states to go. Winner take all is a system that is preferred by the Republicans in their primary, but also the way the Electoral College works, where the candidate that wins the simple majority gets all the Electoral College votes or all the primary delegates. The Democrats don't use this in the primary, but this is how the Electoral College works. Democrats tend to use what's called proportional representation in the primary, and this is how the delegates will be split based on the percentages in the outcome of the vote. So if one candidate gets 60% of the votes in a state, they get 60% of the delegates, and the rest are, distributed accordingly. Um, some people believe that we should use proportional for the Electoral College, and this would make it less, less likely that the person who wins the popular vote would lose the electoral college because it would make states more competitive because there wouldn't be a guarantee that someone would get all of the electoral college votes. The electoral bounce. This is a spike in the polls following a big national event like the party's convention. This year, we kind of have the opposite of that going on with the coronavirus situation. No matter what President Trump does, if his response is continuing to upset people, he may not get a bounce from anything that he does because this situation is pretty much consuming all of our lives, and it's very much going to influence how people vote in November, how they feel President Trump has handled this situation. So I don't know that there's anything. Even the Republicans are not canceling their big national convention, but I don't think he'll get any kind of bounce from it this year because that's not what is on people's minds right now. So there's certain things that people tend to look at um, you know, for an incumbent president, what are they judging that incumbent president on? So this is what President Trump is going to have to deal with as we get closer and closer to November. Um, the economy is a big one, but right now the economy is very uncertain. Um, we don't know what the economy is going to look like next month, let alone what it's going to look like in November. And so, President Trump for a very long time has touted that his economy has been strong. He's had low unemployment numbers. And the situation with the coronavirus has just completely canceled all of that for him because we're going to have massive unemployment, massive layoffs. Some people are predicting a recession. So this isn't going to be a strong point for him. And it's not necessary, the virus is not President Trump's fault, but how he has handled the situation, that's what people are going to judge him by. Demographics. We know that, the country breaks down demographically in a lot of ways, whether it's sex and gender, whether it is race, that kind of stuff. And that always influences voting. And one of the things I talked about this semester was, in a lot of states like Texas, the Latino vote is becoming very, very necessary to win those states. And with President Trump's, detention policy that he's had throughout his presidency, this is going to influence how Latinos vote in November. And so it'll be interesting to see if there's any significant demographic shifts from 2016. War and foreign policy. Before the coronavirus situation, we had the tariff situation with China, the almost conflict with Iran. All that stuff seems like so long ago now compared to what we're going through right now. So that may not be as at the forefront for his reelection. Number four is going to be the big one: domestic issues. So the coronavirus has completely changed our lives in a matter of a couple of weeks. And so this is going to be the issue that I think is going to, decide whether Trump has a chance of being reelected. Um, how has he handled this situation? Is he doing a good job? Is he doing a bad job? That may be something good to write your discussion post over as it pertains to this chapter. But this is going to be the defining moment of his first term and what people will be looking at when they're deciding whether to reelect him for a second term. Has he handled this situation in a way that makes people confident that they should reelect him? Campaign organization. President Trump hasn't slowed down his campaign and rallying and things like that. Whereas on the Democratic side, the two candidates have shifted more into using their influence to help people who are struggling right now. And so, this can be a bad look for the president right now that he is continuing to campaign and call out his opponents, and everyone else is saying, this is not the time for that. It's a difficult situation to be in. Party. One of the things that's going to be tough for Republicans across the board is, you know, they're, Mitch McConnell got a lot of the blame for dragging his feet on the coronavirus response bill. There were two different bills coming out of the Senate and the House, and the Senate was holding up the process where the House had already voted and approved theirs. And the Republicans, because President Trump is in charge, they're going to also shoulder most of the blame for how this situation is being handled. So that could have a very significant effect on not just the president's reelection, but their ability to hold on to Congress as well. And then, of course, the Electoral College. That's the one that's always up in the air each presidential election. Even if one candidate gets all the popular vote, that doesn't necessarily always play out in the Electoral College. And there's always those swing states that we can't predict. And it's hard to predict the outcome of a presidential election in a normal presidential election year, but in this year, I wouldn't even begin to try and predict it because we're living through something that Hasn't happened for over 100 years in our country. The last time was the Spanish flu in 1917, and who knows what kind of influence this situation is going to have on the outcome of politics for the next election. Congressional elections. So this will be important as well. Like I said, people tend to focus on the presidency and not pay as much attention to a lot of the other things that are going on when it comes to elections. Um, so when we're looking at Congress, who tends to run for Congress? Um, the average campaign to run for the House cost about $1.7 million and 10.5 million to run for the Senate. So, like I said, they spend a significant amount of time trying to raise money for their campaign. What makes a congressional candidate successful? Things people tend to look for: self confidence, leadership, interest and knowledge in politics. But, there's a lot of idiots in there too. So that's not always what people are looking for. Most of our Congress people tend to be wealthy. The median net worth for people serving in Congress is about 511,000, but more than a third are classified as millionaires. And it takes a lot of money and influence to run for an elected office at this level. The reason why I have a picture of Alexandria Ocasio Cortez on here, I think we've talked about her a little bit, but her journey to the House of Representatives is very different compared to most people. Whether you love her or hate her is kind of inconsequential. She got elected uh, running. She was an average American. She is a highly educated individual. She has an advanced degree, and she worked as a community organizer and kind of an advocate for different issues and things like that. But that type of work doesn't always pay the bills, and so she was also working as a bartender. And when she ran for the House, she was criticized for. It's like, oh, she's just a bartender. She's just a kid. She's the youngest person to ever be elected to Congress. And a lot of these wealthy old boomers came out to attack her because she wasn't the type of person that usually gets elected to Congress. They've people still trivialize her and call her just a bartender and stuff like that. But it signals a very distinct attitude, and that attitude is that Congress is not for the average American. Well, it should be, but it's very difficult for the average American, especially someone um, living paycheck to paycheck, to ever run for something like the House of Representatives. But she pulled it off. But she struggled. She didn't have money to maintain a residence in D.C. until she started getting paid for working in the House of Representatives, and she didn't have the proper clothes, and depended on the help from a lot of different people. But a lot of people who end up serving in Congress, they come from these wealthy families. They have connections. 1 in 8 members of Congress are related to someone who's already served there. So it does give this kind of impression that it's not for the average American, that it's for this elite class of people. And I think the reason why she upset so many people is because she broke that mold. Whether you agree with her politics or not, she pulled off something that people from her background don't usually pull off, and that's very impressive. Also, historically, Congress has been very male dominated. In 2018, though, 100 women were elected to the House of Representatives, and there are 25 women serving in the Senate. So this is the most women who have ever served in the United States Congress. Um, One of the kind of confusing things about Congress is the incumbency advantage. When we ask people how they like Congress or their opinion of Congress, Congress's approval rating is only between 13 to 20%, but yet we keep electing the same people. So it's a bit contradictory. We don't like Congress, we don't like the job they're doing, but we keep sending the same people there. Um, we talked about what midterms were. We've talked about gerrymandering enough this semester, so I won't go into that again. Congressional campaigns tend to be more very candidate centered, where A lot of the responsibility falls on the candidate to decide to run, to raise their own money, design their strategy, and they essentially have to prove to the party that they can be successful. The party doesn't want to invest time and resources into someone who can't win. Um, Up until the 1970s, parties essentially selected the people they wanted to win in each district and would back them. Today, that was criticized for not being very democratic. These party bosses had so much control over who got to run for Congress. But today, the primaries have given that power to the people to really narrow our choices down between multiple candidates and make sure that the person running is the person we want representing us. In Congress, we have a lot of safe districts, which are districts where the same candidate is almost always going to win, whether it's because they have name recognition or they've been the congressperson for so long. But even if that person decides to step down, a lot of times it's believed that that party will still hold on to that district. What does it take to run for Congress? One, money. Money's the biggest factor. You see how much it costs to run for Congress. So a candidate has to prove they can raise money before the party will even take them seriously. There has to be an open seat. Like we said, in some of those safe districts, there are people like, historically like John McCain or Ted Kennedy or, Mitch McConnell, people like that who have been the representative for 20, 30 years, that people just keep voting for that same person. And so in those districts, there's not really an opportunity to run until one of those legacy candidates decides to step down or retire. Organization. A campaign has to be well organized, good strategy, good people working for the candidate. Name recognition. Are they going to be positive campaigner, negative campaigner? And then what's their message? When we talk about message, right now, Donald Trump ran on a very populist message that he was an outsider, he was a businessman, he wasn't a politician, he was going to go to Washington and drain the swamp. That was his message. You look at Bernie Sanders or AOC, these are people whose message is, for the American worker and the middle class, and, that everyone should have health care. Is there a message that the people are going to connect to? That's what is really going to ensure that people kind of flock to a candidate because they really believe what they're saying. Now, some areas where we could use some major reform. Gerrymandering, we've talked about. Gerrymandering, making sure our districts are drawn fairly and competitively so that, there is, there's as much democracy as possible, that the system isn't being rigged to where really only one party or one person can win. Money. Overturning Citizens United, that's something that a lot of people have spoken about, where this corporate money and this wealthy individuals, that this money should be minimized in our election process. And then incumbency. And one way to do that would be term limits, only allowing people to serve 2 terms in Congress and then they have to step down and wait a few years if they want to run again, or adding a constitutional amendment to change term limits, things like that. And the biggest question is our system broken? Does it work? If it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? And so that's another thing that you could write about in your discussion post. And then down here I have a link for just a really informative video, so just take a few minutes and watch that as well.